There are people who will never raise their voice, yet still manage to disturb your peace. They will not always show up with obvious cruelty. Sometimes they arrive with subtle words, quiet judgments, and a strange talent for making you question your own worth. And if you are not careful, you will find yourself explaining your light to those who were never meant to understand it. But there is a truth life teaches quietly, almost like a whisper in the wind. You do not have to wrestle with every storm that passes through your life in order to survive it. You do not have to match confusion with confusion or bitterness with bitterness. Because the moment you stop reacting to every provocation, something powerful begins to rise within you. Your awareness, your calm, your control. And in that space of stillness, you begin to see clearly who holds peace within you and who only comes to take it away. The truth is, toxic people rarely arrive in your life announcing who they are. They do not always come with loud warnings or clear signs. Instead, they reveal themselves slowly, like ink spreading in water, one small pattern at a time. It is never just one harsh word or a single uncomfortable moment that defines them. It is the repetition of how you feel around them. Confused more than clear, small more than strong, questioning more than certain. And when you begin to pay attention, you will notice that your spirit already knew before your mind was ready to accept it. Patterns are the language of truth when words are dressed in disguise. A toxic presence will often be warm in one moment and cold in the next, generous today and dismissive tomorrow, present when it benefits them and distant when you need them most. And if you only look at isolated moments, you will keep excusing what your soul is trying to warn you about. But when you step back and see the full picture, you realize it was never confusion at all. It was consistency in disguise. There is a quiet strength in learning to observe rather than absorb. When you stop reacting to every single incident and instead begin to notice the repeating rhythm of someone's behavior, you reclaim your clarity. You start to understand that peace is not found in explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. Peace is found in recognizing what keeps breaking it. And once you see the pattern, you no longer need permission to protect yourself. Awareness becomes your boundary. Many hearts suffer not because they are weak, but because they are patient in places where they should have paused. They hope that one good moment cancels out 10 harmful ones. They believe potential is more important than reality. But life does not ask you to ignore what keeps hurting you just because it is familiar. It asks you to trust what is consistent over what is occasional. Because consistency reveals character far more honestly than charm ever will. And so, the simple trick that changes everything is this. Do not study the moment, study the pattern. When you learn to do that, you stop being easily shaken by emotional highs and lows. You stop overthinking every word and start understanding the behavior behind them. In that understanding, something powerful happens. You no longer chase clarity from people who only offer confusion. You begin to walk away, not in anger, but in awareness. And that awareness becomes your quiet form of freedom. There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not need to argue, to defend, or to prove its worth in the middle of chaos. It simply knows when to step back. Emotional distance is not coldness, and it is not cruelty. It is the gentle wisdom of understanding that not every fire deserves your breath, and not every battle deserves your presence. When you begin to practice it, you realize something quietly transformative. You do not have to be deeply entangled in every emotional storm to remain a good, kind, or caring person. Toxic people often rely on emotional closeness as their stage. They need your reactions, your explanations, your frustration, even your tears, because in those reactions they find control. But when you stop giving them that access, something shifts. You do not argue less because you are weak, but because you are aware. You do not respond less because you are indifferent, but because you are intentional. And in that space of intentional silence, their power begins to fade. Emotional distance allows you to see without being swallowed. It gives you the ability to observe behavior without absorbing its weight. When you are too close emotionally, everything feels personal. Every word cuts deeper. Every action confuses you more. And every inconsistency becomes something you try to fix. But when you step back, even slightly, clarity begins to return. You start seeing that some people are not misunderstanding you. They are simply committed to not understanding you. And that realization is not painful, it is freeing. There is a quiet dignity in choosing not to over-explain yourself. You begin to understand that your peace does not require permission from someone who benefits from your disturbance. You stop rushing to fill silence with justification. You stop trying to convince those who are already decided. And slowly, you learn that emotional distance is not about building walls. It is about creating space where your mind can breathe and your spirit can settle. The world often teaches that closeness is always love, but life gently corrects that belief. Not every closeness is healthy, and not every distance is rejection. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to step back from what constantly drains you, not in anger, not in revenge, but in quiet understanding that your energy is not meant to be scattered in places that never return it with care. And so, emotional distance becomes your silent protection. It is the moment you stop reaching for validation and start returning to yourself. It is where you realize that peace was never found in fixing others, but in no longer losing yourself in them. There is a moment between what happens to you and how you respond to it, a small, almost invisible space that most people overlook. Yet within that space lies your greatest strength or your greatest vulnerability. Toxic people understand this more than words can explain. They are not only observing what you feel, but how quickly you feel it. Because speed in emotional reactions often becomes the doorway through which control enters. When you react immediately, you give away more than words. You give away direction. You show where it hurts, what matters most, and what can be used again. Not because you are weak, but because emotion, when unguarded, speaks faster than wisdom can arrive. And those who thrive on disruption are skilled at reading that speed. They learn your patterns not through understanding you, but through watching what pulls you out of your center. But there is something quietly powerful about delay. Not silence born from fear, but silence born from choice. When you do not respond instantly, you interrupt the rhythm they depend on. You break the expectation that you will always engage on command. In that pause, you take back something essential, your ability to decide what deserves your energy and what does not. Quick reactions often feed toxic behavior because they create a loop. They say something sharp, you respond emotionally, they escalate, and suddenly you are no longer responding to truth, you are responding to provocation. And in that space, the original issue is lost. What remains is a cycle of reaction that keeps you emotionally entangled while they remain in control of the tempo. The faster you move, the less you see clearly. But when you slow down your response, something shifts in the atmosphere. You begin to notice tone instead of just words. You begin to recognize intention instead of just impact. And most importantly, you create distance between feeling and action. That distance is where clarity grows. It is where you remember that not everything spoken to you requires a return. There is no need to match urgency with urgency. Not every fire is asking to be fed. Some moments are designed to pull you out of your calm so that you abandon your perspective. And the simple trick is realizing this. You do not lose anything by not responding immediately, but you lose much when you do. In that restraint, you are no longer easily shaped by someone else's emotional pace. You become steady where they expect disruption. You become still where they expect reaction. And slowly, without loud declarations or dramatic exits, you step out of the control they once held through your immediacy. Not every silence is empty, and not every pause is weakness. Some silences are full of awareness, full of control, full of quiet understanding that the next moment does not belong to emotion alone, but to choice. The simple act of pausing before you respond may seem small on the surface, but internally it is a shift in power that most people underestimate. It is the moment where you stop being pulled by impulse and start being guided by clarity. Toxic people often rely on urgency. They want immediate reactions, immediate answers, immediate emotional engagement. Because in urgency, reflection disappears. And when reflection disappears, control becomes easier to maintain. But when you introduce a pause, even a brief one, you interrupt that rhythm. You create a space where their influence cannot move as quickly as they intend, and in that space, you begin to see things differently. The pause is not about ignoring reality. It is about refusing to let reality be shaped only by the first emotional wave. When something is said or done that triggers you, the natural instinct is to respond instantly, to defend, to correct, to explain, but that immediate response often carries more emotion than wisdom, and emotion, when unfiltered, can be predictable. Predictable reactions are exactly what manipulation feeds on. When you pause, you do something quietly powerful. You reclaim authorship over your response. You allow your mind to catch up with your feelings. You give yourself time to ask, even silently, is this worth my peace? Or what is being pulled from me right now? That small moment of reflection changes the direction of everything that follows. Because now your response is not a reflex, it is a decision. There is dignity in not rushing to answer everything that disturbs you. There is strength in not proving yourself to every challenge thrown your way. The pause allows you to step outside the emotional trap of immediate engagement and observe the situation for what it truly is, not just what it feels like in the moment. And often, in that observation, you realize that many things lose their power when they are not instantly fed with attention. Over time, this practice reshapes how people interact with you. Those who expect emotional reactions begin to lose interest, not because you are cold, but because you are no longer predictable in the way they need you to be. And those who respect your presence begin to value your calm more deeply because they understand that your responses are not driven by impulse, but by thought. The pause before response is not silence for its own sake. It is silence with direction. It is the quiet space where control returns to you, where emotional pressure loses its grip, and where you begin to respond not as a reaction to others, but as a reflection of your own peace. There is a quiet wisdom that arrives only when you have been spoken to unfairly more times than you can count. At first, the instinct is always the same: to explain, to correct, to defend your name as if your worth depends on being understood by everyone who misunderstands you. But life has a way of teaching, gently but firmly, that not every insult deserves your explanation, and not every accusation deserves your energy. Some words are not spoken to seek truth. They are spoken to provoke you, to pull you into a space where you must lower your calm to match someone else's noise. And when you enter that space too often, you begin to notice something important. You are no longer defending your truth, you are surviving someone else's projection. That is where understanding begins to shift into wisdom. There is a kind of freedom that comes when you realize you do not need to answer everything. Not every misunderstanding requires your voice. Not every judgment requires your clarification. Because the more you try to explain yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you, the more you slowly abandon your own peace in the process. And peace, once disturbed repeatedly, becomes harder to return to. Toxic interactions often thrive on your need to be understood. They know that if they can pull you into defense, they can also pull you out of balance. But when you stop treating every insult as a call to respond, something changes in the energy between you and them. You begin to see that silence is not surrender, it is selection. You are choosing what deserves your voice and what does not. There is strength in not reacting to every word thrown in your direction, because reaction gives importance. And not everything is important enough to live in your mind twice. When you stop defending yourself in spaces that are not built for truth, you begin to preserve something far more valuable than approval. You preserve your clarity. Over time, you learn that people who truly value you do not require endless explanations to see your character, and those who are determined to misjudge you will never be satisfied with any explanation you give. That realization is not bitter, it is liberating. It removes the exhausting belief that you must constantly prove your existence, your intentions, or your worth. And so you begin to respond differently, not with anger, not with withdrawal, but with quiet discernment. You let unnecessary words pass without residence in your spirit. You allow misunderstandings to exist without carrying them as burdens. You stop turning every insult into a courtroom where you must defend your name. In that shift, you begin to understand something profound. Your peace is not protected by how well you argue, but by how wisely you choose not to. And in that wisdom, you no longer lose yourself trying to be understood by those who were never listening in the first place. There is a kind of silence that is often misunderstood. People mistake it for weakness, as if not speaking means not knowing, and not responding means not caring. But there is another kind of silence that is far deeper than absence of words. It is the silence of awareness, the silence of choice, the silence of someone who has learned through experience that not every argument deserves the breath it steals from you. Arguments in draining situations rarely begin with a desire for truth. More often, they begin with the need to dominate, to provoke, or to pull you into a space where your calm becomes scattered. And once you enter that space, something subtle happens. You're no longer discussing reality. You're reacting to emotion. And in that reaction, clarity becomes harder to hold. Silence interrupts that pattern. It refuses to participate in emotional chaos. It does not rush to fill every gap or respond to every challenge. Instead, it creates space where confusion cannot easily survive. Because silence, when chosen consciously, does not mean you have nothing to say. It means you are no longer willing to say it in a place where it will not be heard with respect. There is a quiet power in not answering every provocation. When someone expects a reaction and receives none, the dynamic shifts. The energy they were feeding on is no longer available. The conversation loses its emotional fuel, and in that absence, the situation begins to reveal itself more honestly than any argument ever could. What remains is not escalation, but exposure. Silence also protects something very important, your inner stability. Every unnecessary argument pulls you away from yourself. It forces you to explain, to justify, to defend pieces of your identity that do not need defense in the first place. And over time, this constant defense can leave you mentally exhausted, as if you are always standing in a courtroom that never closes. But when you choose silence, you step out of that courtroom. You stop presenting yourself for judgment in places where judgment was never fair to begin with. You stop treating every emotional disturbance as something you must solve immediately. Instead, you begin to observe, and in observation, you regain something that argument often takes away: perspective. There is also a quiet dignity in silence that cannot be imitated by words. Words can be twisted, repeated, misinterpreted, but silence remains untouched. It cannot be argued with. It cannot be escalated in the same way. It simply stands, steady and unshaken, refusing to become part of something that drains your peace. And slowly, you begin to realize that silence is not emptiness at all. It is selection. It is the decision to only engage where there is sincerity, not provocation. It is the understanding that your energy is too valuable to be constantly spent proving what should already be evident. In that understanding, silence becomes more powerful than any argument ever could be, because it does not fight for control. It removes the need for it entirely. There is a kind of silence that is often misunderstood. People mistake it for weakness, as if not speaking means not knowing, and not responding means not caring. But there is another kind of silence that is far deeper than absence of words. It is the silence of awareness, the silence of choice, the silence of someone who has learned through experience that not every argument deserves the breath it steals from you. Arguments in draining situations rarely begin with a desire for truth. More often, they begin with the need to dominate, to provoke, or to pull you into a space where your calm becomes scattered. And once you enter that space, something subtle happens. You are no longer discussing reality. You are reacting to emotion. And in that reaction, clarity becomes harder to hold. Silence interrupts that pattern. It refuses to participate in emotional chaos. It does not rush to fill every gap or respond to every challenge. Instead, it creates space where confusion cannot easily survive, because silence, when chosen consciously, does not mean you have nothing to say. It means you are no longer willing to say it in a place where it will not be heard with respect. There is a quiet power in not answering every provocation. When someone expects a reaction and receives none, the dynamic shifts. The energy they were feeding on is no longer available. The conversation loses its emotional fuel. And in that absence, the situation begins to reveal itself more honestly than any argument ever could. What remains is not escalation, but exposure. Silence also protects something very important, your inner stability. Every unnecessary argument pulls you away from yourself. It forces you to explain, to justify, to defend pieces of your identity that do not need defense in the first place. And over time, this constant defense can leave you mentally exhausted, as if you are always standing in a courtroom that never closes. But when you choose silence, you step out of that courtroom. You stop presenting yourself for judgment in places where judgment was never fair to begin with. You stop treating every emotional disturbance as something you must solve immediately. Instead, you begin to observe, and in observation you regain something that argument often takes away: perspective. There is also a quiet dignity in silence that cannot be imitated by words. Words can be twisted, repeated, misinterpreted, but silence remains untouched. It cannot be argued with. It cannot be escalated in the same way. It simply stands, steady and unshaken, refusing to become part of something that drains your peace. And slowly, you begin to realize that silence is not emptiness at all. It is selection. It is the decision to only engage where there is sincerity, not provocation. It is the understanding that your energy is too valuable to be constantly spent proving what should already be evident. In that understanding, silence becomes more powerful than any argument ever could be, because it does not fight for control. It removes the need for it entirely. There is a deeper way of seeing people that most of us are never taught early in life. We are taught to listen to words, to respond to sentences, to take things at face value. But words are often only the surface layer of something far more complex. Beneath them, there is intention, and intention is where the truth quietly lives, even when it is not spoken clearly. When you only react to words, you remain trapped in the surface of every interaction. A sharp sentence can disturb your entire mood. A careless remark can occupy your mind for hours. But words, by themselves, are not always reliable guides to truth. They can be shaped by anger, insecurity, habit, or even the need to control a moment. And if you respond only to what is said, you may end up fighting shadows instead of understanding reality. But when you begin to observe intention, something important changes inside you. You start asking quieter questions, not what did they say, but why was it said this way? Not how do I respond immediately, but what is really happening beneath this exchange? And in that shift, your awareness expands beyond reaction into understanding. Toxic behavior often depends on distraction. It wants you focused on the surface so you never look deeper, because the surface is where confusion is easiest to create. A single sentence can be twisted, exaggerated, or taken out of emotional context. But intention cannot hide as easily when you are calm enough to notice patterns over time. It reveals itself through repetition, tone, and consistency. When you stop reacting immediately to words, you give yourself space to see what is actually being communicated beyond them. Sometimes what sounds like criticism is really insecurity. Sometimes what sounds like anger is really an attempt to control. And sometimes what sounds like confusion is actually a deliberate attempt to keep you emotionally unsettled. Observing intention does not mean excusing behavior. It means seeing it clearly. There is a quiet strength in not being pulled into every verbal spark. When you react too quickly, you often respond to the loudest part of a message, not the truest part. But when you slow down internally, you begin to separate noise from meaning. You stop treating every sentence as a personal verdict and start recognizing emotional patterns instead. This way of seeing also protects your peace, because when you are always reacting to words, you are always in motion, mentally and emotionally. But when you are observing intention, you become still enough to choose your response wisely. And in that stillness, you are no longer easily manipulated by tone alone. Over time, you realize that understanding intention gives you freedom. You no longer feel the need to respond to everything said to you. You are no longer controlled by the emotional weight of every statement. Instead, you move through interactions with clarity, recognizing that what people say is not always the full truth of what they mean. And in that clarity, you begin to respond not to noise, but to meaning. And that changes everything about how you protect your peace. There is a kind of strength that does not need to raise its voice, and yet it changes the entire direction of a moment. It is not loud, not dramatic, and not concerned with being seen as powerful. It is quiet, steady, and deeply rooted in awareness. That strength is self-control, and it is often the one thing that separates emotional reaction from emotional mastery. Self-control begins where impulse ends. It is the small space where you choose not to follow the first wave of feeling, but instead allow yourself to remain present long enough to understand what is really happening. In toxic environments, this becomes especially important because those spaces often depend on your lack of control. They thrive when you react quickly, speak impulsively, or allow emotions to carry you further than your clarity can follow. When you are easily pulled into reaction, you become predictable. And predictability in emotional dynamics is often where influence takes root. But self-control disrupts that predictability. It creates a pause in your behavior that cannot be easily anticipated or manipulated. And in that pause, something important returns to you: choice, the choice to respond differently or not respond at all. There is a quiet transformation that happens when you begin to practice self-control consistently. You stop seeing every emotional trigger as a command you must obey. You begin to recognize that feelings are signals, not instructions. They can inform you, but they do not have to define your next step. And this understanding slowly changes the way you relate to conflict, tension, and provocation. Toxic influence often weakens when it no longer receives immediate emotional access. When someone expects a reaction and receives calm instead, the dynamic begins to lose its familiar shape. The control that once came from emotional unpredictability fades because you are no longer participating in the cycle that sustains it. You are no longer feeding it with urgency, explanation, or defense. Self-control is not about suppressing emotion. It is about directing it. It is the difference between being carried by a current and learning how to stand steady within it. You still feel, you still notice, you still experience the impact of words and behavior, but you no longer allow those experiences to dictate your response without reflection. There is also a deep form of freedom in this practice. When you are no longer reacting impulsively, you are no longer constantly repairing the consequences of those reactions. You are no longer explaining what could have been avoided or regretting what was said in the heat of the moment. Instead, you begin to act from a place of awareness where your responses align more closely with your values than with your triggers. Over time, self-control becomes more than a behavior. It becomes a boundary. It protects your peace without needing to announce itself. It removes you from emotional cycles that drain your energy and places you back into your own center. And in that center, toxic influence loses its grip, not because the world around you has changed, but because you have learned not to be easily moved by it.